Just give me a thumbs up. Good evening, everyone. My name is Janice Keefe, and I'm the director at the Nova Scotia Centre on Aging and professor and chair in our newly named Department of Aging and Family Science here at Mount St. Vincent University. It's my pleasure to be helping to host this event tonight, this fireside chat on the very important topic of aging is our future, navigating the next 50 years. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Mount St. Vincent University is located on Chibuktuk, part of the Mi'kmaq, and the unceded ancestral territory which remains the homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the covenant chain of treaties and peace and friendship signed between 1729 and 1779. These treaties are living agreements that establish the rules for an ongoing treaty relationship between nations. We pay respect to the knowledge embedded in the Mi'kmaq cultures and custodians of the lands and waters, and to the elders past, present, and future. I also want to give you a little bit of housekeeping information. The accessible and regular washrooms are on this floor. You go out the back door and take a left, go right down the hall, and they're there. Gender diverse washrooms are on the 4th floor, which is just one level up from us. There's an elevator or stairs. In the unlikely event of a fire or an emergency drill, half of the room can go out this way. There's an exit on that side of the room, and the other half, that goes right outdoors, and the other half can go on this side of the room, and then you take a right, and you're outdoors as well. So let's get to the main topic. Aging is our future. When I was in my second year at the University of Prince Edward Island in 1981, I took a course in sociology where the concept of baby boom, population aging, and this growing baby boomers that were going to happen were introduced. I was amazed that at that time, the proportion of people 65 and older was, from the 71 census, 8%, but it was projected to be 20% by 2025. And I thought, well, surely I could get a job in that field. And guess what? I did get a job in that field. And guess what else? We are actually over that in this area of the country. In fact, in terms of population aging, in Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia is 22% of the population is 65 and over. And Newfoundland and Labrador, where one of our guest speakers hails from, is 25%. So we're living longer. We have over 12,000 centenarians in Canada. That's people who live to the age of 100 or more. But this isn't just an older person's issue. Youth also need to be thinking about this. If you're in your 40s or 50s, how much money do you need for the next 50 years? The Freedom 55, it's more of a joke than reality for most. Oftentimes, from Stats Canada in 2020, they report that 60% of Canadians do not have access to a workplace pension plan. Those that do are often in defined contribution versus defined benefit. And how much does your employer contribute? Did you ever think to ask that when you were joining a company? I certainly didn't. It was a real shock for my first year Intro to Aging students that I taught this winter to realize that if they didn't have a Canada pension plan, many women didn't work outside the home, so they wouldn't receive CPP, or they didn't have a workplace pension, the maximum they would receive from the federal government would be less than $2,000 a month. And the students are like, well, you can't live on that in Halifax. And I said, that's right, it's a problem. So what do these age numbers mean anyway? We hear that 70 is the new 50. We talk about a silver economy or the third act. That third act may be when you retire from one career only to rebrand yourself into something totally different, earning a new degree, starting a new business, or beginning a new relationship. What we do know is that aging is our future. Whether it's being in your 90s and feeling more isolated because many of your dearest friends have passed on, or in your 70s thinking about how to age or or to move to a place that is more amenable to your needs. What we do know is that financially we need to plan. Socially, we need to plan to be active and engaged. We need research into action to help us live longer and more healthier than ever before. But these actions should not only be an individual responsibility. As a society, we need to plan. We need to shake off ageist attitudes that stereotype and discriminate against older people. We need to treat everyone, regardless of their age, with respect. Our communities need to be more age-friendly. Our businesses, be they grocery stores, restaurants, recreation facilities, need to be more welcoming to older persons. Our institutions, be they in healthcare, financial services, housing, education, to name a few, need to examine their policies and their delivery modes for their implicit ageist policies. And finally, we need to educate all professionals earmarked to support older people, be they in business, law, healthcare, and so on, to recognize and respect the rights and dignity of each person, regardless of their age. Okay, I'm going to stop my rant. Tonight is about facing and embracing our longevity story and help us to be better positioned for our individual and collective future. We are so very fortunate to have two exceptional women joining us to discuss this topic in our fireside chat. There will be some time at the end of their discussion for questions. We have some roaming mics, and for those of you online, there'll be opportunities to place your questions in a chat. And so don't forget the reception. This is followed by a reception for those of you who are joining us in the room, so that we'll have some time to meet with our guests and explore our conversations even further. So it's my pleasure to now introduce Margaret Gillis and Anne Martin Matthews. Margaret Gillis is the founding president of the International Longevity Centre Canada. It's a leading edge policy shaper working to identify ways through which older adults can live healthy, fulfilling, and active lives. She's also the co-president of the International Longevity Centre's Global Alliance, and that's an alliance of the international centers across 16 countries. She's an award-winning executive and an innovative leader. Margaret played a key role in establishing the Age-Friendly Community Program in Canada and internationally. Other career highlights include establishment of the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism. Margaret has a strong credential in regards to human rights, working with and speaking at the UN General Assembly on behalf of older people. And I'm sure she's going to share with us some of her active work for a United Nations Convention of the Rights of Older People in Canada and internationally. Anne Martin Matthews has focused her career on issues of aging and social gerontology. Anne was born in Newfoundland and was a faculty member at the University of Guelph and at the University of British Columbia, where she recently retired with the honor of Professor Emeriti. Her publications are numerous, including 2 books, one on widowhood, one on work and care, and numerous volumes, edited volumes, journal articles, chapters on health and social care, work-family balance, and rural aging. She's a former editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal on Aging and current member of the editorial board of Aging and Society in the UK, and has received recognition for mentoring of students. I know this firsthand. I was Anne's first PhD student. God love her. In addition to her extensive academic career, Anne was the scientific director of the Institute of Aging, which is part of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Under her decade-long research leadership, the Institute of Aging led the development of the Canadian Longitudinal Study of Aging. It's a 20-year study of 50,000 Canadians aged 45 to 85. In recognition of her contribution in advancing research on aging, Anne was inducted as an officer of the Order of Canada. So I'm going to now turn the floor over to our guest speakers for the fireside chat. Over to you, ladies.
Thank you so much, Janice.
Thank you, Janice.
It's lovely to be here when your first PhD student is host of the event, so thank you for that. Margaret Gillis and I have known each other a long time. I think it's over 25 years.
Yeah.
Or thereabouts.
You're not on.
Do I have to? I thought he said he could.
I sound like Big Brother, but we need you hooked in here.
Bring it over this way. But I thought he was going to turn it on.
There we are.
Are we there now? Okay, good. No. What I was saying was that it was lovely to be here with my first ever PhD student hosting this event. And Margaret Gillis and I have known each other about 25 years, and so it's a real opportunity to be here in Nova Scotia and have a chance to chat with you tonight. Because we've both been working in this space for such a long time, I think a very natural question actually is, did you ever think that we would both be at a point where we're having a conversation about population aging and where we're headed over the next 50 years? So what are the issues that come to mind when you think about that, Margie?
Well, I started in the field 21 years ago, and at the time, I was working for the Government of Canada. I was the director of the Division of Aging and Seniors, and I thought I was going to have a really easy time moving this issue forward because of Canada's demographics. Some of the numbers Janice just shared with us, with the fact, for instance, that pretty soon we're going to be a quarter of the population older persons. I'm over 65, so I'm one of those people, that we would be having a fairly big role in society, and that the government needed to prepare with policies and programs to respond to that. But it was not as easy as I thought it was going to be. And, I look back on that career now, and I think there was elements of ageism even in the Government of Canada at that time, because as we tried to push policies forward, we often were met with really stony silence. But Anne and I actually worked on some great pieces, and of course, Janice also mentioned the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, which I think is a real seminal piece in terms of moving us forward over the next 50 years. And you were responsible for getting that through the door, getting that funded, which was a bit of a nail biter, by the way. When we're talking about how hard it was to get policies through the government on older persons, that was just one of them. And I don't know if you wanted to say anything more on that, or...
Well, I can just quickly say, you may be aware that, of course, there is a site for the CLSA here in Nova Scotia. It's one of the three major sites across the country. And actually today, I walked down Morris Street and actually stood at the building that houses the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. People were going in there. So it was a real particular thrill to see it there. It's now been going for about nearly 15 years. And has had multiple waves of data collection with people from all across Canada. And when we talk about what we're going to want and need to know as we move forward, as we plan for the next 50 years, I think many of us see this as a resource for the nation. That even when the CLSA comes to the point in about another 5-6 years where they're no longer collecting data, there are years of data on people aging from age 45 to 85. If there's anyone in the room who is a participant in the CLSA, I'd love to hear from you later on in the reception. It's always terrific to hear of people's experiences. So Thanks for the little advertising opportunity, but Morris Street is where the Halifax home, the CLSA is.
We also worked on a thing called the Age-Friendly Cities and Communities program, and Janice was one of the original researchers with us. And the idea of that project was to actually ask older persons in 32 cities around the world, what do you need to age in your city? So the idea was, when you stepped out the door of your house, what was it that you needed in your community to help you age in place? And I think it is a program that's now, it's all over the world and it's all over the country. And I hope it lasts another 50 years, because it sort of gives an umbrella for communities to look at where they have gaps in the needs for older persons and fill those gaps in. So, you know, if it's benches so you can walk to your grocery store, or if it's proper lighting, or in Canada, snow removal, it's whatever those things are that let you stay in your community and remain active. So it's a program that we're quite proud of. But just back to those early days, I think what it really showed me is that we need to keep fighting to get policies and programs for older persons, and that remains to this day, sadly. It also was really strange working in government, because I had worked on women's programs and children's programs, and when we talked about women and children in government, we always talked about their rights, their human rights. You know, the rights of child. There was a convention on the rights of the child. There's a convention on the rights of women. There's a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. We never talked about the rights of older persons, and there is no convention on the rights of older persons. And so when I left government, when I retired in 2014, I set up the International Longevity Center and joined that alliance of countries because I felt like we needed to change the discussion on older persons from a giving kind of, you know, we're going to give you something because you're older, to a rights-based discussion. Your right to health, your right to home, you know, your right to be a part of your community. So that was, you know, kind of how we ended up here on this stage today. So I'm not surprised we're still having this conversation, and I think we probably need to have it more frequently, and we really need to start to getting active to make sure that we are receiving what we deserve to receive in terms of human rights and policies and programs from our government and our community. So I guess that's my answer to that.
That's, yes, and there's more to say and more to come, of course. One of the things that Margaret and I were talking about this earlier today is often a very problem-based focus to discussions about aging in later life, and we will, over the course of this evening, obviously address some of those issues. But let's begin by talking about the success story that comes with the fact that we are a population that has aged, that we are the first population in history to live this long. So it is an unprecedented success story. So any comments you'd like to make, Margaret, about that?
Absolutely. I think we almost need to be more thoughtful and celebrate the, you know, the longevity of our population. A lot of countries don't enjoy the lifespans that Canadians have, which is around 80, 81, 82. And then even certain populations in our communities don't live those kinds of long lives. It's something that we need to look at in terms of equity and human rights again. And the long lifespans of Canadians really reflects the success of modern medicine, a better sanitation, issues like vaccines, which have had a direct impact on prolonging the lives of children and Canadian citizens. So if you think about it, in 1900, about 1 in 5 children died by the age of 5. And most families would have experienced the loss of a child. And I think of my Cape Breton grandmother who outlived 4 of her 8 children. In contrast, today, only 1% of children, less than 1% of children, die by the age of 5 in Canada. And if you think about life expectancy in 1900, it was about 48 years old. By 1950, it was 69 years old. And as I mentioned, it's now around 82. So those things like routine vaccinations against measles and mumps and polio and typhoid are public health victories that have led to the you know, the aging of the population and saved millions of lives, quite frankly. So we need to celebrate that, and we need to fight the anti-science movements that would lead us back to darker times. And I think if you just go to a cemetery and look at graves before 1950, you'll see there are a lot of children in those graves, and that's not the same after that date. here in Canada. So that's a true story of success, and it, it tells us really that, things like sanitation, healthcare, and vaccines are the fountain of youth. It's the reason why we have lived long lives in Canada. The other kind of positive aspects of longevity include leading a fulfilling life now into our 80s, 90s, and sometimes beyond that. And that comes with the fact that the lengthening of our lives in Canada also led to improved physical health over that time. So we live longer and we're healthier than ever before. And that improved health also includes mental and cognitive functioning. So, while we all fear dementia, in 2024, only 8.7% of Canadians over 65 had dementia, and most of those were very late in life, much older than 65. So the increased growth and learning experience is a really vital part of longevity. It gives us time to pursue our passions, acquire skills, and live enriched lives. Older people now contribute more to society through wisdom of age and through the resilience that aging teaches us. So one of the things that we see is stronger social connections, greater financial stability with grandparents supporting families at times through life, a sense of purpose and fulfillment. So I think if we just think about this in a nutshell, it's increased emotional intelligence, stronger relationships, and a sense of joy and peace that comes from older age that sometimes you don't have in your youth. So we can leverage longer life by realizing the gift of longevity and acknowledging that longer life helps society both financially, spiritually, and emotionally. So I think those are things we really need to think about. And we often dismiss that in the kind of curse of ageism. But there are many, many positive things that older people bring to society that I think we really need to acknowledge.
It's interesting in terms of the comment that you make about the positive things that can come with later life, and this is a comment that I'll draw out a little bit more in my remarks tomorrow morning, is to acknowledge that some of the studies of 85 and over around the world, to your point, Margaret, actually emphasize the diversity and the range of experience and really life condition for people over the age of 85. That there's not necessarily an equation of being over 85 and this notion of decrement or decline or deficit. There may be that more toward the end of life, but certainly there's no one-to-one correspondence. There are many people who are living vigorous, healthy lives well into advanced old age. And of course, one of the issues we're trying to learn more about is, why is that the case? I think also to pick up on another point that you made about the decline in the prevalence of dementia, that's not to negate the extraordinary challenges when one has a loved one who has dementia and when you're dealing with dementia. It's also, and we know that many communities and some people will be talking about this in their presentations over the next 2 days of the conference about the increases in specific areas of this province, even in populations with dementia. They require service. But worldwide, we're actually seeing a decrease in the prevalence of dementia. And that's attributed to better education, better health care where these issues are available. And that's important to acknowledge. And I think the point that you make about some of those declines also speaks to the point that we learned when I was with the Institute of Aging through our Mobility and Aging Strategic Initiative that much higher proportions of older people will experience mobility challenges in later life than will experience the kinds of cognitive decline that we associate with dementia. So it's as high as 30% of people over the age of 85 will have a mobility challenge. So that's just in terms of thinking positively about also how do we support populations as they get older. So those are just to reinforce some of the points that you were making. So there's also the issue, of course, we see some of these success stories around old age, how we better invest ourselves in enhancing the opportunities of later life.
Absolutely.
Any
Well,
comments on that?
there's kind of two pieces to that question. The first piece is, and this is because I come out of public health, that there are things that we need to do for ourselves to keep ourselves healthy. And that includes, all the obvious stuff you all know: eating well, exercise, not smoking, not drinking much, and staying socially connected to your family and friends, which is really key. But all of this presumes that you have all the very basics of what we call the determinants of health. The idea that you have a roof over your head, that you're financially secure enough to be able to afford food and clothing, your medications, you have access to medical care, and that you have something in your life that engages you and makes you happy. The sad part, though, as we'll be discussing shortly, is that not all older Canadians have these basic needs fulfilled, and there needs to be policy and programming that supports persons who are in situations where they cannot help themselves stay healthy because of lack of access to basic needs, and make sure that those people have what they need to do to live long and healthy lives. So we need to address the problems in our system that are prejudicial to older persons. And we need to flip our thinking about healthy aging. It's not a nice to do, but it is a human right. So very simply, we need to have the following: somewhere to live, with all that means in terms of access to food, and something to do that makes us happy, and someone to love. And that's that whole social connection place. And if you have those three key pieces, then you can age, pretty healthily.
I'm going to come back later on to, and this is not part of something we really talked about, but I think it is important. When Margaret refers to the policy levers, and I think at this stage in my life, I am more impatient with the reality of what has not been achieved in the 45 years of my career. We've been talking about aging for a very long time. And I think many of us, as you alluded at the beginning in your experience with government, thought it would be easier to get the message across, to get the political buy-in to what you recognize as necessary as a society. And it is a frustration to me, and I'm less patient about it than I used to be, that we have not been able to advance, though, in the policy agenda around issues of aging. So maybe before we finish this evening, because you've got decades of experience in the policy realm, working with the Government of Canada, and now outside working with the UN, how do we make those policy changes? And for those of you who are staying around for the next 2 days of the conference that's here, was reading the abstracts for the presentations over the next few days. And many people talk about providing a baseline of information for policymakers, information that will guide policy development. And I look at that and think now, how? How are we actually going to do that? What are the success stories that we can point to that we can learn from? So let's come back to that, because you've got experience in this area.
Yeah.
But let's talk about some of the challenges as well.
Sure. So we've talked about some of the good news, but let's talk about some of the bad news. With regard to the press, we always hear about aging is all about ill health, being a burden on the healthcare system, a strain on the pension system. So we cannot look at policy issues without discussing the term ageism and its horrific impact on longevity. Now, ageism is defined by the World Health Organization as the stereotypes, which is how we think, prejudices, how we feel, and discrimination, how we act towards others based on their age. And the World Health Organization tells us that every second person is ageist. So it makes it one of the most pervasive isms and prejudice. Ageism has a huge impact on longevity and quality of life. And it's associated through research with things like reduced longevity and poor health outcomes, poverty and financial insecurity. And we just need to think here about the Canadian pension programs, and I think Janice mentioned this briefly. If you get all of the programs, it replaces about 40% of your pre-retirement income. So you know, you're going to have a change of life if you haven't got savings to buttress that. And so it's something we need to think about for older people now, but also for younger people who are going to be coming up through the system, and making sure that there's funds so that you can live healthily. The other issues that are problematic and bad news are workplace harassment based on age, loss of work due to ageism, loss of self-esteem and confidence. That leads to that killer, social isolation, which, you know, we always hear about is like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, so you don't want to be socially isolated. Some of the other aspects of ageism are being patronized, ignored, insulted, assuming that you're not able to make a decision for yourself, and, you know, for instance, the healthcare system, you know, or determining what medical treatments you might want. Negative images in media and the broader society. So you just think, you know, go buy a birthday card for anybody over 40, and, you know, it's all this, you know, insulting stuff that you would never see about someone's race, religion, gender, or anything else, but it certainly is there about age. And ageism is interesting because it's really, really expensive. Studies in the United States show that the cost to the American healthcare system of ageism per year is a staggering $63 billion. That's with the B. So we can figure out what that is in Canada just by comparing populations, but there's a huge impact. So we need to address this issue of ageism. It's still socially acceptable, and we need to change that, and we need to challenge it because it challenges longevity. So.
There was no script for a social participation part of this evening, but I think it would be interesting to get a sense, a show of hands, of any of you who feel that you've either personally experienced or observed examples of ageism. Is this resonating for you? So a number of people around the room do have that experience, okay, which is just interesting.
Oh, for
if
sure.
I could, I'm very interested in this reference to 63 billion.
Yeah.
So we know that would be pretty close to 100 billion in the Canadian dollar context, if that's US dollars. Do you know how that was calculated, Margaret?
Yeah, well, I can share the study with you, and maybe what I can do is give it to you later.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
So,
okay.
and there was another study done that was interesting similarly, where they looked at a bunch of studies on ageism and the impact of it. And again, it was like huge numbers of the impact on society and on budgets.
Okay.
So if you think you're not being, you know, availed to proper health care,
Yeah.
you know, the cost of that to the society, just think about healthcare dollars. You know, if you're not given the right treatments, if you're ignored, we'll talk about this in a minute about what's happening in the Canadian healthcare system, but all of that has an impact because it costs more, because you get sick, and then you need the healthcare system. So we need to think about how to keep people well, and that's part of where.
Okay. I can see in terms of someone being denied access to work, et cetera, that's obviously very easier to attach a cost.
It's a lot of things.
So it's a whole range.
I'm going to get into
no,
it.
I'm just interested because I
Yeah.
think when we talk about these figures is
Yeah.
what are the array of things
Yeah.
that are taken
The
into
array of
account in
things,
making a calculation like that, for sure.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's important with ageism to realize that it can have consequences even when it's quite benign. If at some level the intent is not negative. I will just, you know, personalize and say I had the experience this week my husband's 10 years older than I am, coming through the airport and having asked for wheelchair assistance for him. And, you know, it was very helpful. It was beneficial in lots of ways. But there was just an element of feeling patronized was probably the word, an assumption of a complete lack of ability in a whole range of contexts, well beyond that one. And I was thinking, this is good, we need it, this is positive, and yet it doesn't feel comfortable.
Well,
And I think that's an element of what you're talking about.
Janice mentioned this. We were on a CBC show yesterday, and Janice mentioned how, you know, you go into the doctors sometimes when you're older and you're like dearie and sweetie, and there's a kind of diminishing, like you're a little kid. They kind of, you know, infantilize you. And I think that's one thing where it's like, well, hold it. I'm an adult just like you, and I'm not calling you sweetie, doctor, so maybe we can just get back to calling me by my name. But, you know,
Yeah.
there is that aspect to it. So should I keep going
Yeah,
on challenges?
please, because there
Yeah.
are lots of challenges.
You know, in this decade, 2020 in Canada, we've seen some really huge challenges to longevity and quite plainly attacks on the human rights of older people. So I'm going to just go through a couple of quick ones because you're probably familiar with this if you've been listening to the news, particularly during the pandemic. You know, first of all, we know we have a housing crisis in this country, and that impacts all ages. And we need affordable housing and housing that's suitable for older age. In the pandemic, we completely failed older Canadians who were living in long-term care, where being in long-term care turned out to be a ticket to COVID-19 infection and in many cases death, with little effort since to really address the long-standing problems in this system. And we all knew about those problems. There's been 30 years of research and reports over and over saying this system needs to be updated and refined and fixed, and it has not been. And so we were, in the first part of the pandemic, the worst. We had the highest death rate in long-term care of any OECD country, and that is because we have been ignoring report after report that the system needs to be transformed. And you cannot talk about older persons without discussing the need to look at our home care system. We've discussed, you know, just now the state of long-term care homes, but part of the answer to dealing with long-term care is to increase access to home care so that older people can stay in their homes longer, which is where they want to be. And by the way, most studies show that it is much cheaper to do that. So we need to look at new and innovative homes, such as naturally occurring retirement communities, intergenerational housing. We need to look at work by other countries like Denmark, who have invested heavily in home care and use long-term care only in the most extreme cases when care is necessary, and it actually costs less. Another issue that older people are experiencing, and this is really to our incredible shame in Canada, is homelessness. And it is at the highest rate ever for older persons, and we are the highest cohort according to Canada's National Shelter Study in terms of increasing numbers of homelessness. Many older people who are homeless in Canada don't have access to shelters, and the temporary housing isn't designed for older persons. Moreover, many older persons in precarious housing and who are, you know, living or sofa surfing or living with friends aren't included in any of these statistics. So we know that it's not good. And older people who are experiencing homelessness tend to have a history of injustice and trauma, which requires special help, and that just simply does not exist. So we were starting to talk about home health care, and I think all aspects of ageism lead to double standards. And with respect to health care, I want to give you a scary statistic that we did last year in a poll that we did, ILC Canada did, and we found that 63% of older adults surveyed in Canada felt that they had been unfairly treated for their age in the healthcare system. They were denied treatments, offered different screening, or different medical treatments than other citizens. Many conditions are going undiagnosed or undertreated, such as pain, fatigue, and depression. Indeed, the ILC Global Alliance led a movement to get old age withdrawn as a diagnosis at the World Health Organization. So what this means was you could record a death as old age, like as if old age is a disease as opposed to a time in life. And what happened is, then you don't really know why that person died. So if you're looking for ways to, you know, address deaths and change healthcare, you need to know the reason why the person died. And so we pushed to get that old age definition out so that the recordings that went into the World Health Organization actually showed it was a heart attack, it was cancer, whatever the death was, as opposed to just calling it old age and hiding the data from us. We also know something that happened in long-term care in Canada during the pandemic, is that older persons were denied access to the hospitals. And that's kind of unforgivable when you think about what it would be like to die of COVID in a long-term care home where you don't have an ICU unit. There was also discussion across the country in the early days of the pandemic of age-based triage protocols, which would prohibit people over 65 from getting access to hospitals, and that actually happened in Italy, you may recall. So how ironic is it that the generation that actually brought Medicare to Canada was actually denied it when they needed it most? Similarly, in employment, we see older people struggling to find work due to ageism and limited retaining options. In tough times, we often see older persons are the first to be let go and the last to be rehired. And if you look at how to address this, you need to look at retirement provisions that restrict people from returning to the work. And we need to look for ways to make workplaces more welcoming for older persons so that they can come. So we need to think about things like the hours of work and all of those sorts of things which could help older people to stay in the situation. And I just want to go with one last bad news piece, and we can go back to good news pieces soon. But I want to talk about climate change, because older Canadians have also died disproportionately because of extreme weather. And we know, for instance, that in the heat dome in BC, paramedics were late in responding to the needs of older persons, and the government was not properly prepared to protect older persons, even though we knew what to do. We know what to do. It's not rocket science. But what happened is that 80% of the people that died in that heat dome were over the age of 65. What ended up happening was Human Rights Watch, the big human rights organization, actually criticized the government of Canada and BC for not responding to the needs of older persons. And in fact, when we were in government, while working together, when Anne was there, the government of Canada, when I was working on this program, actually brought together for the first time emergency preparedness experts and aging experts. We did a paper we brought to the United Nations about what are the policy needs, to keep people safe in emergencies. And you wouldn't think the government of Canada, BC, had a clue it was ever done. It was like not one provision of it was applied. And so we need to start looking at making sure when we prepare policies that somebody actually implements them, particularly when you can save the lives of our fellow citizens. So we've got some issues here that are really fundamental.
Can I just jump in and ask a question about that? Because I had a colleague actually come to the University of British Columbia recently, and he had worked on emergency preparedness issues in the United States. And I'm trying to encourage him to identify with aging as a research area more. So I was actually telling him about some of the very informative literature that exists. People have written about, for example, the response here in Halifax to Hurricane Juan and what was learned about the particular disadvantage of older people in some of that circumstances, the Manitoba floods, which were some decades ago, the ice storm in Quebec. There actually are some interesting examples in Canada of lessons learned from these various natural disasters. So I tried to find a single place to send my colleague to learn a little bit about this, because he was teaching a course on sociology of disasters. Right. And I thought, well, the role of older people is particularly important. So you could find what we would call fugitive literature about Hurricane Juan or the Manitoba ice storm or Manitoba floods, et cetera, et cetera. So I just kind of put together a little sort of a summary from all these different studies to give to my colleague. But are you saying that, in fact, that a policy statement was developed for both at the federal and provincial levels and exists? So how does one know about that? I mean, that becomes the question.
We actually, it was a policy for governments, and Canada brought it to the United Nations Social Development meeting. This would be early 2000s, 2007 or 8. Now, the thing needs to be updated because so much has changed. We didn't have the kind of technology we have now back then, and the connectedness, and a lot of pieces would need to be updated. But the basics were there. You need to tell older people and make sure they know if there's, depending on whether it's a cold or heat, what you need to do to stay warm or stay cool. You need neighbors looking out for each other. You need to have the healthcare system primed to make sure that older persons are getting the right treatments. And it's really basic community development stuff. But again, it fell apart completely certainly in the heat dome and a couple of other of the disasters that had happened recently. And we learned it. I'm going to tell you something very interesting. It came out of, and it was Canadians, it was Gloria Gutman and the IAGG. Hurricane Katrina had happened in New Orleans, and so it was the first sort of big event that wiped out a city. And we were all hearing that poor people were dying, but when we looked at the statistics, it was old people that died. And they were dying because they hadn't access to medicine, which is another big part of it. And so the American government, after that happened, put a lot of money into figuring out how to save older people. And they actually looked at one of their states, which was Florida, that had good programs in place because of the number of hurricanes and because that state has so many older people. And we learned a lot, and a lot of that went into this policy paper about what to do in these pieces. But again, what happens here? We have a disaster, and nothing of those principles were followed. In Florida, they know where older people are. They know the buildings that have older people. They send people in to make sure they're okay. They go before the hurricane hits. All of those things should have been done, and were not done.
So it will be important both at a federal level, but more importantly at a provincial level.
They were both responsible, really.
To be aware.
Yeah.
That's really helpful.
How's our timing?
Well, I'm watching.
10 minutes, okay.
Yeah, okay, we're on track, I think, to think about what we need to do, Margie. I mean, there's lots of areas where we can focus. So if we had to identify a couple of key initiatives,
so I'm going to talk about first the ones I'm working on. So, and then we can think about others, and probably people in the audience will have some good ideas. So, how do we get ready and how do we change? So one of the things that we did at International Longevity Centre, Canada, is we set up something called the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism. And how this came about was the World Health Organization did the Global Report on Ageism in 2021, and it had some really basic things that we need to do to ensure that older people are treated properly. So, with the idea that we're almost a quarter of the population, and with that in mind, we created this coalition. And so what it is really is the coming together of major aging organizations in the country. So we talked to all the national aging organizations and asked them to join. And we started off with sort of 16 of the larger ones. The idea was that we needed to think about ways we can confront ageism and bring about social change in Canada based on that World Health Organization ageism report. So as we discussed, the treatment of older persons, particularly the examples I just told you about, is a wake-up call that we have an ethical and moral and legal imperative to establish effective ways to address ageism and make sure that we protect the human rights of older people. So the idea of the CCAA is to raise awareness of ageism, and that means looking at adoption of laws and policies and practices that support human rights and social inclusion of older persons, and ensure that our fastest growing demographic receives its due profile and its due consideration. And I want to talk to you about the Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, which Janice mentioned briefly in the introduction. So I've been working for the last 10 years on trying to get a Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. And the reason I'm doing that was that when I was in government, I actually worked in the children's programs, and I was a Canadian delegate responsible for implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I could see the difference in the way that the government treated the issue of children when you have the force of international law behind it, and even more importantly, the force of the UN Human Rights Commission, where when you have a convention, you can go as an activist and actually bring issues of concern to the Human Rights Council where Canada has not followed through on the rights of older persons. So I think about long-term care as one that would be an obvious one. We would want to make sure that there was change included in. And I'll give you a little example. When I was there, Indigenous Women's Group went before the Human Rights Council on Children and brought up the issue that the Government of Canada spent far less on schooling for Indigenous children than it did for children across the country in provincial. And they were very effective in getting the Canadian government to change that policy. It got a lot of traction in the press that this was happening because you had a world stage to say our country isn't doing what they need to do. So that's another piece. So just to give you a little bit of a background on it so it makes a bit more sense if you're not used to it, a United Nations Convention would be a legally binding document, and it's signed by member states, like Canada would sign it, and it sets out in detail the rights that it's going to bestow on its citizens. So think of it as sort of a separate set of laws that would protect the rights of older persons. And as I said, other groups have it and have been very successful. So if you think about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we've seen a real increase in accessibility issues, a real increase in attacks on institutionalizing people too early without their consent. So there's a lot of positive things that can come out of here. And I think we need to think about it, it's a method to achieve positive change by combating ageism, by guiding policies and principles, and improving accountability of governments at all levels, which we certainly need. It also brings together activists and academics, and it also leads to increased activism. I don't know why, I guess because people start to think about their rights in a different way. So you'll start to see an increase in activism when we have these conventions. So, they educate, they empower, and they would see older people as rights holders and not, with protection under national law, not just as receivers of the gifts from the country. So there is some good news on that after 10 years of working at it, and huge fights with the Canadian government, who never stepped up and supported us, but recently have. In April, the United Nations Human Rights Council approved a resolution that we are going to begin to start drafting a convention on the rights of older persons. So we still have to do that, but it's a step in the right direction, and hopefully that will start to change attitudes societally about ageism and also about the fact that healthcare, housing, work, responses in emergency preparedness are human rights issues, and they need to be addressed, and the problems we've seen in our country need to be addressed. So.
Well, I was there 10 years ago when, as a volunteer, you led the creation of, really created the International Longevity Centre Canada, and I think any of us who are aware of, and you've just explained it quite clearly, aware of what a convention could achieve, the teeth that it could actually bring to a process. I think in Canada, many of us are very concerned that after everything that happened with COVID-19, with that extraordinarily high death rate in long-term care, we've gone back in so many cases to business as usual, as it was before. So I think the heartening news of what you're saying here is that this would provide a mechanism for actually trying to address what we all saw, what the military saw when it was brought in those cases, and yet we believed this was a moment for change, and it didn't happen. But this would be the way to achieve that. So thank you for the 10 years that you've given, the dedication to this process. And we were talking before we came over today, and I was asking Margaret, how long would it take to actually, now that the process has started at the UN, could be 5 years. 5 more years. And so I was encouraging her to hang in there and stick with this, and as much as she could, because you've been so successful in getting Ambassador Ray and others to be really involved. So thank you for that.
Great.
Fabulous, wasn't it? Oh, wow, it was great.
Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Don't be shy. For those of you that are online, you can email your questions to nsca@msvu.ca. So it's 3 acronyms. Nova Scotia Centre on Aging, NSCA, Mount St. Vincent University, at msvu.ca. Okay, for those of you online, please send your questions on email. For those of you in the room, I think we have a couple of wonderful student ambassadors. I have to put my glasses on to see them. If you have a comment or a question, and while you're thinking about that, I just want to return to something that you had mentioned, Anne, that we should be quizzing Margaret about around policy levers. And so I was thinking we were going to circle back there.
I thought we would, hoped we would during the Q&A. Thank you for starting.
Yeah, but why don't we ask her about these policy levers and your question that you wanted her to help us as academics, because there'll be a lot of discussion about what, we want our research to make a difference. We want things to change, but sometimes as researchers, we don't always know how to do it very well. So,
Well, Anne, you mentioned this wonderful quote from, was it?
Andre Picard, the one I was
Andre
talking.
Picard, but also the Minister of Health, who was the one that brought in Medicare. I'm blanking on her name.
Monique Bégin.
Bégin.
Monique Bégin, 15, 16 years ago, was a former Minister of Health, wrote that Canada's a land of pilot projects.
Yeah.
Perpetual pilot projects. And I will allude to this again in my remarks tomorrow morning, but I think it is very telling that we often do establish projects that are wonderful demonstrations of things that can be achieved, things that can be done in a policy context. The challenge is scaling up from there. That's the challenge.
I used to work with a really wise man. He was a director general in the government of Canada, and he said policy changes in three ways. It's a political platform, so we need to go after our political masters on that and get aging onto that platform. It is grassroots movements, which is what we're trying to do with the Canadian Coalition on Aging, is get against ageism, is get a grassroots movement going in terms of older persons, and it's also tenacious bureaucrats. So whenever I work on policy issues in the government, I go after the government, but I'm also in with the bureaucrats, because you need them on side often, because they're actually giving the advice to the political masters. So one of the things we need to do is we need activists to really connect in with the academic community, so that we are getting, the activists are hearing the latest data and the best approaches, and then we need to be working together to really make sure our government is responding in a way that actually can activate change. And we have not been terribly successful on that, and I think it's something we need to really think about doing.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really smart advice. I know in some of our work we're really trying to do that IKT approach, which is called, it's a fancy acronym for integrating the knowledge users at the time when you're developing your research, so that there's actually some buy-in already from the policymakers that we need to have the answer to this, so then we can change something, so we could get evidence to make a change.
And there's a little step in there too, because when Anne and I worked together, I think the budget of the Aging Institute was around 63 million, which is great. It should be that or more. But I was on the policy side, and I had something like a little under 2 million to implement $63 million worth of research. So how the heck was that ever going to happen? So we need to be looking at making sure that the bureaucrats and the government, is able to respond and has people in place and the policy acumen to take that incredible research that our Canadian researchers are doing and actually make changes in the lives of older people.
Great. Any comments? My glasses on. There's one. And
There's
one over
two.
here. We got two. Sim can go here, and Lennon can go there. Perfect. How about we go to you first? And then we'll come back to Kathy. Okay.
So about 7 years before COVID in Alberta, in the long-term care homes, most of them were rural, there was a flu outbreak. The flu shot was ineffective. So when they had their Christmas parties, families and children brought flu into the unit. And the things that you mentioned that happened during COVID were identical for the people that came down with the flu, and my father was one of them. There were no physicians that came on site. There were no EMTs allowed to come on site. It was locked down. Family members were not allowed to go into the unit until you got the phone call that your family member was near death.
Oh, dear.
Wow.
So we knew before.
It's not just COVID.
Yeah.
It's others, even
Yeah.
a norovirus going through a unit like that. So the statistics, the research, has to be able to go into the charts in places like long-term care and collect the information on how was the situation actually handled and were the rights of those patients for healthcare actually even existing.
Thank you, that's a good point.
Yeah, really good point. I think there's some challenges when we don't learn from our mistakes, and we keep thinking that we're going to do better to learn from our mistakes during COVID. But you know, as there was a lot of discussion about the Safe Care Act, and that hasn't really come to fruition. I've been on 2 royal commissions with the Royal Society of Canada, led by Carol Estabrooks. One very early on saying what we needed to do, and then the second one sort of as a reflection and talking about these issues of human rights, that we need to now move to human rights framework in order to be able to create change. So I think there's a real value in the kind of work that Margaret's doing, and that we all need to do with both our talking about it and the groundswell, but also with our politicians, because they're ultimately going to help make the decision. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
My name is Kathy Lively, and I've been a volunteer for over 50 years. Most of that has been with older adults in one function or another. And I'm hoping there's a way we can collaborate, and when we advocate, we're not reinventing the wheel. Resources are scarce, as you're saying. And how do we do that? Is there one
Yeah,
place we
I'm
can do
going
that?
to, maybe the easiest thing to do is I will give Janice the website where you can join the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism. So you can join it as an individual, you can join it as an organization as well. And so the work that's happening right now on that, the kind of first tranche of work is that we're looking at the healthcare system and looking at ways to educate healthcare workers on ageism and making them more aware of it. So, you know, you kind of have to start with biteable pieces. So that's kind of the first piece of it. But what we'd really love to do ultimately is have some kind of really large-scale anti-ageism campaign, so that we educate Canadians about ageism and what it's costing our society, so that we can change that. So this thing's new, we're just starting. I guess we'll see how it goes.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Can I just add to that? I was reminded after our Maritime Connection interview that Pam Fancy, our Associate Director, and Mercy, one of our research coordinators, are working with Age Well in Nova Scotia. Now, Age Well used to be called Community Links. So you may have heard of it as Community Links. They're a community-based organization. And they have a small grant. I think I'm not sure if it's from PHAC or the Nova Scotia government, whatever, but it's actually to help people be disruptors. So helping people, like older people, to recognize when ageism exists, so that, like, sometimes we just take it for granted. We just assume that's the way it is, but it's really not the way it should be, right? And so when we get all of these ageist remarks, sometimes we internalize them. It's kind of like that, oh, you're putting someone out because you need to ask for a wheelchair. They're patronizing you. And like, that's not right, you know? And so this is a little project that we're helping to evaluate, and it's trying to help us understand, through some tools and education, how to, I would say, call people out in a very nice and an informative way, and with a positive outcome, you know? So I know one time, oh, we're online. She's probably not listening. I had a dean who was talking about how we needed more young people because they have all the good ideas. And I thought, you know what?
That's awful.
I said, that's ageist. This is in a chairs meeting. I'm thinking, oh my God, did I just say that out loud? And, but you know, she took it. She said, yeah, you're right. And I called her afterwards because I thought I should apologize. She said, no, you just don't need to apologize. You're absolutely right. It's just what we come out. If you're young, then you have good ideas. If you're older, then you're, you know, out to lunch, you know. They're not recognizing the wisdom and the value of what we have to offer. So anyway, I just want to tell you that little story. So that, and the fact that where you can see Pam, she's back there dressed the same as me, apparently. There's a code. And so you can ask her about that Age Well project. Any other questions? Yes, a couple. One here and one at the back. There's one at back by Pam. Sim, yeah.
I just wondered about the preferred jargon that we should be using, because the term seniors is generally used, and you're talking about older persons.
Yeah.
And I'd like to make sure I use the right jargon.
Yeah,
Excellent.
the United Nations actually passed a resolution, and they use the term older persons. So that's the one I generally use. The government still has, you know, a Department of Seniors and a seniors minister, so we need to get them up to date. And I think partially, you know, we don't use the term elder because of the connection to the First Nations, and elder has a specific, and then elderly has a whole bunch of bad connotations with it. So older persons is generally what we use in terms of the jargon.
That's
So
a
thank
great
you for that
question, though,
question.
because you never really know, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that even some of the peer-reviewed journal articles do not, they have a statement, thou shalt not use the word elderly when you're describing this
Yeah.
population. Because, yeah. Did you have something to say?
No.
Not about that? Okay. Back. The back.
Thanks. First of all, thank you so much for that talk. It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, my question is, so you're talking about this really pervasive issue of ageism and kind of elevating it to the policy level to try and tackle it in a really systematic and structural way. I'm wondering if there are any models or examples from other countries or other regions where that's been done in a really effective way.
I think everybody's kind of where we are in terms of addressing ageism. It's almost like it's a new ism, to tell you the truth. But I think where we can learn things, and for instance, with respect to the Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, we've been starting to talk to the disability community because they were really effective at it. And they were very effective in raising the whole concept of ableism. So I think there's connections into other groups that would probably be worthwhile as this movement starts to grow, to make sure we have learnings from them, particularly since they've been successful in lots of ways. You know, ageism is an old issue, but it's a new concept. And I think that's part of the reason why we need to start all getting together and talking about it. You know, we need to name it and shame it. We need to call it out, as you mentioned in our discussion yesterday. You know, we need to have, you know, the Canadian government, if you go on the website, they've done all kinds of studies on ageism. But where's the policy outcome from that? You know, that's what we need to see. We need to be calling them and saying, great, you showed it. It's clearly here. What are you guys doing to change it? And so far, not a lot.
Do you think, I mean, I'm interested because often you'll hear that there isn't action at the federal level because the federal government in a federated model, as we have in Canada, doesn't actually have that much direct influence over issues that impact older people. It's mostly at the provincial level where that actually happens. I'm interested in the current discussions about federal, provincial, territorial boundaries and things that can apparently be changed in Canada by the 1st of July is the aspiration. And I know some of that will have to do with, you know, trucking policies and labor policies, you know, and training of people. But could something like this actually take advantage of that moment, this moment that we're in, where we're thinking broadly about across provincial and territorial, well, particularly provincial jurisdictions, things that might change. And
I
aging is a
think the
key
federal
issue.
government has a role here, and one of the things the federal government is supposed to be doing is sort of be the connector across
Umbrella,
provinces.
yeah.
So if they actually decided to do something like a campaign on ageism, just to use that one example, or a campaign about, healthcare and how older people need to be treated in the system, that is a role they should be playing. And they have the funds to do that if they wanted to do that, I believe, as an ex-employee. A retired employee.
A retired
Yeah,
employee.
former employee, yeah.
Former, right. Very good. Any, question back here? Sure, thank you.
Thanks. I have a comment and a question. I've been listening to the Coming of Age podcast out of Ontario in preparation to coming to this conference, and that's where I first heard about the term ageism. And a couple examples have come to mind. This is the comment. One being going to appointments with my mother, who's 73, and first time noticing that the physician was speaking to me more so than to my mother.
Yeah.
The second time, I really noticed it, and then my mom said to me, like, why is he talking to you and not to me? Like, I'm the one with the issue. And I said, I know, I noticed it too, and I felt very uncomfortable. And the next time we're going, I'm going to say something. And then she never needed to go, which was great. But anyway, that was one of my first experiences noticing such a thing. But I wanted to ask you what your response would be to this type of comment that I heard during the pandemic, which was from a parents that had 4 young children, and really felt the effect. They also homeschooled their children, and they really felt the effects of their kids not being able to socialize with other kids because of all the rules, and they were getting very frustrated. They felt like their kids were missing out on years of developmental opportunities and growth, and they made a comment to me about, coming from a place of there's not enough. I guess there's not enough care for everyone. There's not enough of anything for everyone. So why should older people who are near the end of their lives, why should we, all us young people, change our ways and deprive our children to save older people or to allow them to live longer? And I was just shocked by the comment, but it's kind of stuck with me. And I'm just curious to know what your response would be to such a comment.
Well, I think that's probably the most ageist comment I've ever heard, so it's a really good example of, what ageism is. I don't understand that concept of not understanding that human rights begin at birth and end at death. It doesn't stop at 60 or 52 or whatever number you pull out of the air. All of us have the right to access to society's, provisions. And it is not based on age any more than we would say no one under the age of 5 is going to be allowed in a hospital during a pandemic. We'll say people over 65 can't. But can you imagine if we did that about children? So I think we need to change the parameters of what human rights mean. And they are not based on age. They're based on you being a breathing human person who deserves respect like everyone else.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I would also add, I have an even worse one for you that I often show when we talk about COVID, because I have this newspaper article that says, I can't remember the exact words, but it's like the governor of, I know it was Texas.
Yes, it was
It was Texas, and said that older people should volunteer to die because they were costing too much during COVID.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, obviously he was younger. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, we got a question over here, okay.
Thank you. Wonderful conversation there. Thank you very much. Especially, I echo the work on human rights with United Nations. I worked with Council of Europe for several years, and I know that since 2014 they started something which is pretty much some initiative to bring a convention, because Council of Europe drafts conventions for the European Union as well, and nothing straightforward or no action that was turned into kind of a result, a concrete one. There was like an assessment taking place to see how things are going in this, if I may call it, sector. Some member states, they were looking through it, but never came to an action. So I guess this was just a comment, but I also have a question. my research is looking very much at aspects of gender differences in aging. And I feel like any policy that should be developed in a way needs to look at that intersectional approach of which are those vulnerable groups that
Yeah.
are more kind of experienced in that ageism.
Yeah.
In the studies of pain, somehow we know in the healthcare it is women that are treated a bit more poorly. There is a bit of more ageism towards them because they are not trusted that their pain is really high or something. So I'm assuming there is more and more of those aspects that kind of, what is your observation on that, on the work that has been going on so far? Was there like an attention given to this part?
Well, you're dead right about the multiple aspects. We call it the prism of isms. So if you add sexism and racism and ageism and ableism, and you're one person who you're going to have multiple impacts. So we do need to be thinking about that. And very interestingly, my organization is about to do some policy recommendations and work around older women, particularly racialized and marginalized older women. So you're right on a track. I mean, there's tons of evidence, and you probably know this as a researcher, that shows that you add these things together, and there you have multiplier effects, negative multiplier effects. So I'm glad you're working on it.
Yeah, great question, great comment. Really appreciate that. Questions? Last call? There's one right up here. Who's going to get there first? It's Sim. She's on the road. We have some fabulous graduate students here that have been helping to volunteer for us. I have a wonderful staff at the Center on Aging, and yes, so they're always around the place. Please go ahead, sir.
I really liked your reference to tenacious bureaucrats along with grassroots and political level. That's fertile ground, I think, that's often overlooked. But I wanted to ask about, I think moderator Ann raised it, what's going on across the country in terms of all kinds of economic and social and cultural change. How are you going to get attention to older people?
I'm not sure I totally heard that. So you're asking how the political, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear. My hearing's not the best.
Given what's going on, the sort
Yeah.
of tidal wave of change,
Yeah.
socially and economically, is blamed on the Trump phenomena, but whatever.
Yeah.
How are older people and issues related going to get attention in all of that?
Yeah.
Right, we're so focused on the economic loss
Yeah.
or what may
Yeah.
be happening with the U.S. So, with Trump's tariffs, et cetera, then how are we going to get aging on the agenda?
Basically, yes.
I think it's the same point I've been trying to make in terms of we have to be activists. We have to be calling for it, particularly older people. Because if we're not talking about what's happening to us, and by the way, we don't want other people talking for us, we need our experience explored. So there needs to be, we need to join together and make noise. We need to have that being done intergenerationally. We need younger people to support us and understand that, just as we would in all generations fight against racism or pickenism. So I think in times like this, when stuff's kind of going sideways, it's almost more important to keep focused and be loud. I think there's a wonderful quote by Maya Angelou that says, we need to be angry and we need to march it, vote it, speak it, call it out. And I think that's what we're going to need to do. And I think hopefully that movement starts to grow as the population of older people aging grows. And we just should not be putting up with being treated as secondary citizens. It's just not right.
I agree.
If I can add a quick comment to that, Margaret will actually be speaking in British Columbia in October. We have an organization in BC called COSCO, the Council of Organization of Seniors Organizations of British Columbia. Not COSCO, you don't shop there, they're an advocacy group, COSCO. And they're actually interested in this particular issue, which I think is really important. I was reminded recently, Andre Picard, that wonderful health columnist in the Globe and Mail, had an article about in British Columbia, where I now reside, that British Columbia was sending cancer patients to the United States at that point because they didn't have enough sites for service for certain types of cancer treatments in the province of British Columbia. And the basis of his article is, we've known for at least 60 years about the aging of the population. We know that cancer is like dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, increase in prevalence with age. We have to get over being surprised by issues of aging in the population, and we have to be stronger advocates. Instead of politely just saying, oh yes, well this is going to happen, is actually, I think to Margaret's point in Maya Angelou's quote, is to be more activist and angry when these things happen. So I'm hoping that with an organization like Costco, when you're in British Columbia, there'll be a sense of that. I don't know if there are parallel organizations across Canada, seniors organizations, but I think we're at a point in time where I worry sometimes that we academics, we talk to one another a lot. As much as I'm a tremendous fan of the stellar work of the Royal Society of Canada's various reports related to COVID-19 and aging, but I'm worried about who's actually reading them.
Right.
Are they getting to the right people? So I think we're at a moment in time where we've got decades now of information, basis of knowledge, experience of when things go wrong, as they so horribly did during COVID-19, but to our colleague's point, not exclusive to that particular time, but actually thinking more and more about how we can actually join in advocacy and be proud of that's what we're doing.
Absolutely.
It's not value-free academics.
Yes, and include people with lived experience
Yeah,
in some
exactly.
of these things as well.
Yeah.
Not just the senior organizations, because they are very important, but there's also those people who have dementia, to include them in understanding our research. Look, this has been a fabulous night. I'm just going to look out there, make sure I'm not missing anybody, but we are going to have a reception afterwards. I have a couple of, we have some door prizes, but before we get there, I want to give a tremendous applause to our wonderful guests, Anne Martin Matthews and Margaret Gillis.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience as well. Thank you very much.
They are a wonderful audience, and I hope you stick around, and we'll be at the reception for a little while following this. I just want to say, too, that tonight's Fireside Chat will be available on the Nova Scotia Centre on Aging YouTube channel, and that'll be by the end of the week. You can link to it from the Nova Scotia Centre on Aging website. So Mount St. Vincent, Google Mount St. Vincent and SCA, and you'll find us. Just a couple of other sort of comments just to, for some of you, when I look out, there's a variation of age here, but some of you, it's your children that you may want to encourage to be thinking about longevity. Those middle-aged people too, they need to be on their radar that they may actually live 40 or 50 or 60 years if they're in their 40s and 50s. So it's about helping to get that interest, I think, out there. And then finally, I want Lan to bring the gift. I don't know how many we have. How many? No, but how many gifts do we have? How many? 3? Okay, so we have 3 gifts, and Roland is one of the winners. There he is. Come on over. I get your gift. Okay, thank you, Roland. All right, and the second one goes to Paula Richardson. All right, Paula's one of our staff members. It's not rigged. Come on up, Paula. Paula is the project manager for our Atlantic research collaboration in long-term care. And while she's walking up, I just want to tell you, Anne is our keynote speaker at the conference that we're having, The Future is Aging, the next 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday. We do have an older person's rate, as far as I remember. There's going to be over 75 presenters there. Some of the students have posters. We have a whole range of different topics that will be there, including the frontier, the new frontier of aging, the perils and promises of artificial intelligence, which I think is going to be fascinating. But there's all kinds of different topic areas around health, around living healthily, around engagement of older people in our research. It really is an amazing conference. About 200 people will be there. So if you're interested, you can talk with any of our staff. So we have one more, right, Lan? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And this is Dorothy Haley. Oh, yay, Dorothy. All right. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, those online, for tuning in to us. And please come and enjoy the reception, and we'll talk a little bit further face to face. So thanks a lot. Thank you, ladies. Look, we're right on.